Good morning. This is Christy Sprague. I'm a weed scientist at Michigan State University, and today I thought I'd just kind of talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the field and kind of open it up for some questions as we kind of move in towards harvest time and seeing a lot of weed escapes in fields at this time. Just wanted to mention a couple brief things. A few things that we've been seeing quite a bit of is a lot of the glyphosate resistant weeds that are showing up pretty much around Michigan. One of the things that's really starting to show up now is if you start driving around, you see a lot of soybean fields where there's glyphosate resistant mare's tail or horseweed, whichever one you want to call it, and that's really starting to shoot up above the soybean canopy. A couple other weeds that we've got more concerns about are obviously the glyphosate resistant pigweed species, and we have two of them in Michigan right now. We have Palmer amaranth, which we first saw in 2010, and we also have common water hemp that we're seeing a huge increase in the spread of that through a lot of fields in Michigan. So we're seeing common water hemp showing up in various places around the state, several different counties, and many of these weeds are not only resistant to glyphosate, but also have resistance to the ALS inhibitors, or we would call them group 2 herbicides, and examples of those are things like Classic or Raptor or Pursuit. Some of those are some of the big issues. So along with glyphosate resistance, with several of these weed species, we have this multiple resistance. Just also want to mention a couple other glyphosate resistant weeds that we do have in Michigan. We have both common ragweed and giant ragweed. Now, giant ragweed is more of a problem kind of in our southern tiers of Michigan, the counties. And that's mostly where we see that, and we've really had a hard time controlling that weed just because it's very aggressive in growth, but because of the glyphosate resistance, we also do have some ALS resistance in that weed. And then common ragweed, this last year, we had two different populations that were identified, one up in Huron County and the other one in Saginaw County. And both of those common ragweed populations were also resistant to glyphosate and to the ALS inhibitors. So as we start looking at some of the management issues, a lot of, as we drive around the state, things that start showing up are probably a lot of these glyphosate resistant weeds. So again, I think what we're seeing is the multiple resistance in all of these weeds, whether it's mare's tail, common ragweed, giant ragweed, water hemp, and also Palmer amaranth. So with that, I know there's a lot of questions on management. We look at trying to manage these weeds, and it really kind of goes back to about 5 different principles. And one of them is to know what weeds you have and whether there's any resistance to them. And if there is resistance, to make sure that you're choosing herbicide programs that would actually combat those different resistance profiles in those weeds. We also want to make sure we start clean, and that's extremely important when we're dealing with horseweed or mare's tail. That's one that we see emergence in the fall and the spring, and we're really starting to see more and more emergence throughout the season. So starting clean. All these resistant weeds really need to have a good soil applied program down as far as giving you a good start or a foundation for weed control. And there are specific ones that we can talk about a little bit later that can go for some of these different weed species. And then if we've got a lot of glyphosate resistance, there's obviously some new technologies out there. We've had Liberty-linked soybeans, and we're also starting to see more use of some of the Roundup Ready to Extend soybeans as potential options to combat some of these glyphosate-resistant weeds or multiple resistant weeds. So with that, that's just kind of a quick summary of some of the things that we're seeing, and hoping to open it up to questions. I believe you can just kind of type in your question on your computer, and hopefully we can answer a few.
Great. Christy, you mentioned that we're starting to see some weeds come through the soybean canopy, and especially these smaller crops like soybeans or sugar beets or dry beans. We're seeing some suspects, and if we have some suspicion that they're the weed species that you mentioned, like some horseweed or mare's tail and maybe some water hemp or some pigweed species, are there any options that we have to control those now?
That's a really great question. We're at the point in the season where most of the herbicides that we would be able to apply are past that time. So many of them have a cutoff at kind of R2, so full flower. Some of them are at R1. Most of these herbicides have pre-harvest intervals. And in all honesty, by the time some of these plants start to flower, they're not very effectively controlled by herbicides. So they're getting too much height. So like your water hemps and your Palmer amaranth at this point are pretty much impossible to control. I would say with those particular weeds, because they are pretty invasive and they are very aggressive as far as seed dispersal, the amount of seed that's produced, and it can really rapidly take over a field, that if you've got small pockets of that, before these things really start to produce viable seed, the best thing you can do is get them out of the field. Whether it's hand pulling, and in some cases there might be a couple acre chunk that you might just want to mow down, work up before they start producing viable seed, because you don't want them. Each one of these plants can produce anywhere from 200 to 400,000 seeds per plant, and that's a lot of seeds to get back into the field. So especially with those weeds, those are the ones you really want to make sure that you try to manage so they don't spread all over. Now with horseweed, it's a different story. That weed is pretty rampant throughout Michigan. It's windblown, and it's very difficult. In some cases, we might have some of those plants that are not producing viable seeds before soybean harvest if some soybeans were planted early. But it's kind of hard to kind of take care of those. If there are some small pockets, again, another way to do it is to just take them out. But at this point, we're beyond the time for making herbicide applications.
You mentioned something really interesting about control, maybe mowing these weeds. How about timing of that? It seems like these weeds are really close to putting seed heads out now.
Yeah, so in these areas where you might have an acre or two that all of a sudden you see this weed that's taking over, you make sure you want to do it before they actually produce viable seed. And right now is a great time because at this point I don't think we've seen any viable seed production of any of the pigweed species, whether it's Palmer or water hemp. We've done some work in the past kind of timing that, and I think right now we're probably just at the point to where things are going to start going pretty quick. So if you've got these pockets, you want to make sure you mow them. Or if you're just going to go out there and hand weed things, get them out of the field, drag them out, and then a lot of people will burn them. So you want to try to make sure that you can kind of contain that seed and destroy it.
Yeah. That leads to another question about if these weeds don't get mowed down or they're not controlled by harvest timing, do you have thoughts or suggestions of what growers should be doing when they're out there with the combine and looking at these infested areas?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, for example, if you start to see one field where you've got pockets, one thing, if you haven't been able to get out there and remove those, you may want to just go around those pockets where those weeds are. When you're harvesting. The other option is if you feel that you actually have to harvest that field and put that seed through your combine, try to harvest those fields last. The last thing you want to do is drag glyphosate-resistant seed from one field to a clean field that you have. So try to harvest any of those ones where you would have any resistance issues last. It's almost virtually impossible to try to get some of those seeds out of a combine, but you have much better luck if you've got time over the winter to try to get through there and clean those out, whether it's, with air and there's just, some of those seeds are so small, but again, you want to try to do anything possible to make sure you're not spreading it to the next field, because combines are probably the biggest source of spread. Okay.
Okay, we've got a question from a grower that says, I've been using a fall burn down with basis blend, glyphosate 2,4-D Banville mix, crop oil and AMS, spring pre-plant, Trivent's glyphosate 2,4-D crop oil and AMS to control mare's tail. Are there options or things that you like in those mixes of a fall burn down followed by spring burn down?
Yeah, and I think where we really start thinking about trying to burn down mare's tail or horseweed, I think those fall applications are extremely beneficial. And kind of looking at your mix of basis blend, glyphosate, the 2,4-D, and the dicamba, Definitely the 240 and dicamba are putting a lot of work into that. We do have a lot of resistance, like glyphosate resistance and ALS resistance, and Basis Blend is going to have 2 ALS inhibitors. So that's probably helping with some of your other winter annual weeds, but maybe not with your mare's tail. But I think that's a good sound program in the fall. In the spring, I really like the fact that you've got a burn down in there with the 2,4-D. That's going to help again for some of those spring emerged horseweed. The Trivents, there's 2 herbicides in that mix that are actually very effective or give us some good control initially of horseweed or mare's tail, and that is the Valor or flumioxazin component and also the metribuzin component. So those are the 2 herbicides along with sulfentrazone that actually give us some decent residual control of both mare's tail, and also those ones will probably be some of our top ones for some of the pigweed species like water hemp and palmer amaranth from a residual standpoint. I would say that with the mare's tail, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of later emergence, and then sometimes those residual herbicides aren't holding out long enough. So if you're in a field that has a very high population of horseweed, you may want to consider switching up some of your soybean traits. We've had some pretty good luck with using Liberty Link soybeans, and you can use the same program that you're using with your burn down with the glyphosate and the 2,4-D, but again, you would want to make sure, or you would have an option in season, and that would be the Liberty in those Liberty Link soybeans. So if you're running into issues with the strategy that you're using now, a lot of it is you've probably got an extremely high weed population, and those residuals just aren't holding out long enough.
Okay. So a follow-up to that other question, Christy, was about changing modes of action. So if we're doing a burn down in the fall, then in the spring, is using similar modes of action okay?
The interesting thing is it looks like you're using a 2,4-D dicamba mix, and we would say that those are both group 4 herbicides, and so they kind of fall under the same thing, but they actually kind of worked differently in the plant. So not everything that is dicamba resistant is 2,4-D resistant, which is a little bit different than some of the other herbicides. So I like the fact that you have both of those in the fall. And then in the spring, along with the 2,4-D, you will get some post-emergence activity from the metribuzin that's in the Trivent. So that's also helping. And then you've got kind of a mixture of what we would say a group 5 with the metribuzin and a group 14 with the flumioxazin that's in that Trivent's mix. So those are, you know, using multiple modes of action. So you're right on the right track with trying to manage that particular weed.
Okay, great. Another question is, if I have resistant weeds and I want to use one of the new technologies like Extend, how do I know which one to use?
That's a good question. So the key thing is to kind of keep in mind what herbicide resistant traits that you actually have in your field, or what actually might be in Michigan. So I can tell you that mostly what we see is we've seen ALS resistance, we've seen trizine resistance, so like things to atrazine, we've seen some glyphosate resistance, and the one weed that we do have that is 2,4-D resistant is wild carrot, and that's been for a long time. So those are kind of the main modes of action that we have that are causing some resistance. And we have found one this last year that's new, and that's PPO resistance. So that's in common ragweed. We got a couple populations where it's actually resistant to things like Flexstar and Cobra. So for our non-GMO soybean growers, that's a tough solution, because those are what we really rely on to control common ragweed. So that's something new. But if you're thinking about the traits, right now we do not have any weeds that are resistant to Liberty or glufosinate, so the Liberty Link soybeans are a good option, and we don't have any dicamba resistance at this time. I would mention that with the Extend soybeans, we can use obviously dicamba and glyphosate, and there's a lot of different precautions to be used with that system. There's a lot of different regulations, and those are the things that you need to be aware of, especially if you're near anything that's a sensitive crop, and non-Extend soybeans are very sensitive crops. So those are some things that we'll be talking quite a bit about this winter.
Great. So you mentioned Liberty Link as one option to control some of these weeds. So if a grower is pretty comfortable with using a glyphosate-resistant soybean product, switch to Liberty Link, what kind of things do they need to be thinking about with managing weeds?
That's an excellent question. So, as I always say, Liberty and glyphosate, they're completely different herbicides. Some people kind of get them mixed up because you have Liberty is glufosinate, and they think, oh, glufosinate has got to be very similar to glyphosate or Roundup, but they're very different. In a Roundup Ready system, when we're using any of the glyphosate products, they're systemic. So basically, you know, you can put it on the plant, it moves through the plant, and that's how it works. With Liberty, that's a contact herbicide, so we need to make sure that we have very good coverage. The other thing is we have some weeds that are maybe not as susceptible to Liberty. So for example, grasses and common lamb's quarters, once they get some size to them, the Liberty is not as effective. So that's where we always kind of say, hey, we really want to control weeds in Liberty Link soybeans when they're about 2 to 4 inches tall. Remember, both of them don't have any residual activity. So again, timing is important. Coverage is extremely important. From a coverage standpoint, we want to be at least 15 gallons of water per acre or more. So 15 to 20 is usually where we shoot at for Liberty soybeans, or spraying Liberty. And then the other couple other things, we want to make sure that we're not making those applications too close to sunset. So in fact, on the label, it actually says not to apply within 2 hours of sunset. And the main reason for that is, again, it's a contact herbicide. And if you think of the weeds that are out there, for example, velvet leaf, the leaves go down when it gets nighttime. So you're not getting good coverage on that weed. And that can happen with some of the other weeds. So those are some of the key things. So I guess time of day, timing, making sure you have good coverage. The other thing is there's a lot of different rates of Liberty you can use. So based on the size of the weed, you may want to increase the rate. Right now, kind of the general recommendation is you have 2 applications that you can make in the season, and you can make those in crop. And I would start out with my first application when those weeds are 2 to 4 inches tall with 29 fluid ounces of Liberty. You want to make sure you include ammonium sulfate with that. That helps it work. And then if you need to follow up, you can follow up again with 29 or even 36 ounces if those weeds are getting big. But our basic recommendation, again, is to start out with a good soil applied product herbicide to get with, to start out kind of a good foundation, and then you're not completely relying on that Liberty to control all those weeds out there.
Great. Christy, another question is, what problems have other states had with extend beans, and what should we be aware of in Michigan?
That's a great question. So probably most of you have seen a lot of the farm press, seen a lot of articles, heard radio, you know, different interviews and stuff. And there has been a lot of issues that have been seen over this last year, particularly in some of the southern states where they have went a lot of acreage to either extend soybeans or extend cotton. And with some of those applications, they are seeing some off-target movement. There is some thought that some of that is maybe not using the correct sprayer technologies, but also there is some concerns with the current technologies that are out there and potential for temperature inversions and potentially even some volatilization. And those are just some thoughts that have come up from down south. So there has been some pretty widespread complaints, particularly in states like Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee. We're seeing a lot more in some of the I states like Illinois. And it's not only on non-extend soybeans, but they're also seeing some issues with some specialty crops, as well as some trees such as cypress trees, which happen to be actually pretty sensitive. So from our standpoint, we need to be aware of some of those issues that have happened. We haven't had tons of complaints in Michigan. We have seen a little bit of off-target movement and potentially some tank contamination where soybeans have been injured, the non-extend soybeans. But again, by and large, we've not had experienced the huge use of it as like what down south. And I think from our standpoint, if we start switching to this more and more, we really need to be aware of what our neighbors are doing. For example, went and looked at a field where two neighbors were actually using Extend soybeans, and one of their neighbors was not, and the neighbor that was not did have a little bit of soybean cupping from the neighbors, and so those are issues. Just talking to your neighbors to know what your sensitive crops are around those areas. And again, I think we'll probably be looking at trying to, if we're going to be using those, really focusing earlier in the season where crops maybe aren't as sensitive from a burn down standpoint and so forth, particularly for some of our horse weed or mare's tail problems.
So it sounds like there's researchers in the country that are trying to deal with this and looking at injury symptoms from dicamba. So it seems like there's a lot of sensitivity to seeing the cup leaves that you described. Does that always mean there will be a yield loss?
That is a great question, and a lot of it really depends on several factors, whether it's the time that the incident occurred. The earlier the soybean, it happens in early soybean production, a lot of times you may not see a yield loss at the end of the season. But as you get closer to flowering and you start to see more severe cupping and so forth, that's usually when we tend to see more chances for yield loss. Another thing is depending on what concentration gets on there. So if it's a direct application versus a drift or something, so it's the intensity of it, the timing, and then also what the weather conditions are. If you have good weather conditions for soybean growth to recover, a lot of times you may not see an issue. But again, it really does come back to the amount of injury you see, the timing of it, and then if those soybeans are able to recover from that.
Okay. Another follow-up to that was a grower is saying, I was talking with a grower from Mississippi, and he thinks that they haven't had as much of an issue with Extend because Mississippi did an extensive education program before using Extend. What should we be aware of?
I think they do have a very extensive education program, and I think that's one of the things that several of the manufacturers as well as MSU has been trying to at least make people aware of it. So education is going to be number one, but again, I think communication is probably just as important. Knowing where you are, what you're, making sure you're doing everything correctly, and what your neighbors are doing. So that's probably the number one thing.
Okay. So there's also a couple other crops in the state. So as soybean fields are rotated next year, so if we know we had some resistant weeds in a soybean field, next year it's likely going to be corn in a lot of cases. Are there specific recommendations that you'd have for that crop?
Yeah, so for example, if we're going to corn, we obviously have a lot more options for herbicide choices to help manage some of these glyphosate-resistant weeds. We're pretty lucky in Michigan. We don't have the widespread resistance to some of the HPPD inhibitors that they're seeing in some other states, which are things like Callisto, Laudis, Impact, Armazon, those types of products. And many of those products are pretty effective on a lot of these resistant weeds. Adding atrazine to some of these actually helps. So the key thing is, if you're going to be rotating to something else, do not rely heavily on glyphosate for your weed control option. Make sure you're looking at other things that will control that weed that is resistant. So for example, if it's water hemp, make sure you have something in there from a soil applied standpoint. We've got a lot of different herbicides like Dual, Harness, any of those pre-grass herbicides, Zidua, actually give us some pretty decent early season water hemp control. And then if we follow up with some of the different HPPD inhibitors and atrazine, a lot of times we do have some pretty good results. So again, making sure that we're aware of what the resistant weed problem is and what are some of the alternative options.
Okay, great. We've got another grower question, Christy, that says, please explain what VaporGrip technology is. How is it different than Banville, Clarity, and Genia?
So the VaporGrip technology is basically kind of an additive they have included in with the dicamba formulation, and it's a proprietary thing, so I don't know what the ingredients are, and many people don't know what the ingredients are. The whole thing with the different dicambas that are out there, so Banville was one of the first ones, then it went to Clarity, And the whole point with each one of these different dicamba formulations is to reduce the chances for volatility. So there was a decrease in volatility from Banville to Clarity, and then from Clarity to both Ingenia and also XtendiMax with VaporGrip. There is also a decrease in the chances for volatility. Now, you can look at a scale and you can say, okay, if this is where Banville is, this is where Clarity is, these other ones are down here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to completely negate that it's going to be zero, right? So it's reduced, but I think as experience is starting to show, we're starting to see, especially in some of those states where they're having a lot of complaints, they're feeling that some of it is due to potentially some volatility. And I think, dicamba, it's a very effective product. Soybeans are extremely sensitive, and we do see potential injury from those. So again, we're just looking at a stair-step effect of reduction in volatility.
Okay, another question is, how long does it take to see XtendiMax/dicamba damage in a soybean crop?
That's also a great question. So for example, if you make an application, a lot of times you are not going to see that injury show up to a sensitive crop for anywhere from 14 to 21 days after application, especially at a very minor or a low rate. So a lot of times you may see something and you'll be like, well, where did that come from? It probably happened from an application that happened 2, possibly 3 weeks ago. As if the conditions are drier and warmer, a lot of times it may take a little bit longer. So there's been some different studies that have shown that sometimes that symptomology may actually develop a little bit, or take a little longer to develop under those dry conditions. So in general, if we were starting to see something, it's probably something that really occurred about 14 to 21 days prior to that.
Okay. So I hear a lot about the labeling and the regulations around dicamba, XtendiMax use, and Ingenia. So I think there's been comments that that's kind of a living document and can change and may change. Do you expect that we'll have different rules coming into the 2018 season?
I think there will be some different rules into the 2018 season. So this last year, these labels all started out very specific. There was websites where different things like tape mixtures could actually be added, and some of those different tape mixtures were added, different nozzles, some of those different things. So especially as we start seeing some of the label changes that some of these states themselves have imposed. So if you look at Tennessee, they had some actually some stricter regulations for those labels after they started seeing some issues. They basically have narrowed the time frame of when you can actually make those applications to make sure that there are no temperature inversions, and they're more specific on actually making sure that applications occur when wind speeds are not above 10 miles per hour. So some of those labels that we thought were already pretty tight on what we could do, I think are going to get a little bit more restrictive as we move forward.
So interesting, there's another question that has come up about these edges of fields or borders. So the question is, what can we do about mare's tail around the edges of fields and ditches, etc.?
That is also a very good question. As far as management along these edges, obviously mowing is one way to make sure that you don't have any seed production. That would be one way. There are some different products that can be used in ditches. Again, most of them are growth regulator herbicides, so you need to be cautious of some of the soybeans that might be next door. But and those will not, those growth regulators are not going to impact the grasses that are in those ditches. They'll just work on the broadleaves. But as we start seeing some of those taller mare's tail, probably those growth regulators aren't going to work that well either. So I think the biggest thing we can do is try to mow them.
Okay. A follow-up question is, would you please explain the difference between XtendiMax, Ingenia, and Fexapan?
Okay, that's another good question. So right now there are 3 different herbicides that are labeled for use in the Roundup Ready 2 Xtend soybeans, and these are all dicamba formulations. Fexapan and Extendamax, both of those are the exact same formulation. The biggest difference is Extendamax, and again, both of these say Extendamax with VaporGrip and Fexapan with VaporGrip. Extendamax is marketed by Monsanto. Fexapan is marketed by Pioneer DuPont. So that's just kind of the big thing. So they're the exact same herbicide, exact same formulation. Genia is a different salt. That's being sold by BASF. It has a different use rate than what Extendamax and Fexapan have. So the use rate is 12.8 fluid ounces per acre, where Extendamax and Fexapan, to get the equivalent amount of dicamba, is 22 ounces. So there's a difference there. Many of the restrictions are the same on all 3 labels, but again, we're looking at basically Extendamax and Fexapan being one formulation and Ingenia being another, and that is basically a difference in salt that is formulated with, and that's also to help hopefully reduce the chances for volatilization.
Great. Christy, do you have any suggestions where growers can look for resources?
Yeah. So we've got a website. It's msuweeds.com. Also, you can go to the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee website and get some of those resources. A couple key things that I would suggest. Dr. Erin Hill, she's our weeds diagnostician down in the diagnostic clinic. So if you have a herbicide-resistant weed, she does all the screening for those resistance, and we've had a great partnership with the Soybean Promotion Committee and doing some of those different screenings. On that website, you can see she has a document called Tips for Collecting Weed Seeds. So if you're wanting to see and test to see if you have a herbicide-resistant weed, whether it's mare's tail or giant ragweed, common ragweed, for example, common lamb's quarters, we haven't found any glyphosate resistance, but that's always one that we're suspect of. So those are ones that you can actually collect, send in, and she can do the testing. And there's a nice document on how to collect those seeds and where to send them to. We also have several fact sheets that kind of talk about management of some of these glyphosate and multiple resistant weeds. So again, msuweeds.com is a good resource to pull some of those out. And then many of those resources can also be found in the Weed Control Guide for Field Crops. In December, the 2018 guide will be out. And it's great because we've had a really good working relationship with the Michigan Soybean Promotion Committee to do research to basically come up with solutions that hopefully we can include in here with some of the fact sheets as well as some of our recommendations for control of these weeds.
Great. Thank you for sharing your time, and thank you for all the research you've done in support of the Michigan soybean growers.
Thank you.